Hi there, it's Marcella Friel, founder of the Women, Food, and Forgiveness Academy, and I'm in conversation today with my dear friend and esteemed colleague, Mary Sheila Gonnella of Occidental Nutrition. And today we're going to talk about ancestral trauma and ancestral healing. So if you feel like you have patterns in your being and in your relationship with food and in your relationship with self-care that feel really, really deeply entrenched and difficult to navigate, you might well be carrying ancestral trauma. And while that can sound pretty heavy duty, the good news is there's a way to work with that we're going to unpack for you today. So, hey, Mary Sheila.
Hey, Marcella. Nice to see you.
Yeah, good to see you too. So, I want to start the conversation about ancestral healing by talking about genetics. We have been entrained, over time to think about genetics in a way that Bruce Lipton, who wrote the book, The Biology of Belief, he calls it genetic determinism, where we believe that our genes are fixed, immutable, and that's the way it is. So if you have a gene, like let's say you have the BRCA gene for breast cancer, BRCA1 or BRCA2, like the prevailing view of that is too bad. Basically you're determined, you're predestined to have, to be susceptible to breast cancer. But what has been emerging, especially from thinkers like Bruce Lipton and others, is this whole new relationship to genes called epigenetics, where genes are actually much more, how should we say it, influenced by set and setting and environmental factors. Mary Sheila, to talk, to set the stage for this conversation about generational trauma and generational healing, I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about your friend Miriam, because you and I have been talking about her quite a bit. And I think that a lot of women watching this video might be able to identify with her story, either personally or like vis-a-vis someone they know who might be like her. Can we
Yeah,
bring Miriam into the space here with us?
yeah, yeah. So one of my dearest friends, who was sort of like a second mother to me, passed away about 2 years ago, and from colon cancer. And she was in her mid 70s, early 70s, and she had longevity in her bloodline. So I kind of took for granted that she would be there for me for a really long time. She was a really dear friend, and she was also a therapist, which sometimes are really great friends to have. And Miriam had a really great life. And but Miriam also, she kind of had a little bit of a cloud over her. Like, it was never like, how you doing? It was never really like, I'm great. It was like, I'm okay. One of the things that I learned from Miriam through our friendship was that she was actually conceived during World War II and during the Holocaust. And her father and his brother were the only survivors of his family to flee and leave Eastern Europe and live. Everyone else on his side of the family passed away or was murdered by the Holocaust. And and so he came to America, and World War II was still happening, and she was conceived. And when she told me all that, I said, "Gosh, I wonder if that has something to do with your sadness." And she said, "Yeah, I kind of think it does." And at that time, I was also studying amino acid therapy, which is sort of just to help like your brain chemistry if you feel maybe more depression or sadness or even cravings and sleep. It's like helping to feed your neurotransmitters basically with proper nutrition, and that's one of the roles of amino acids. So as we're talking, so in the middle of studying with my teacher, who's Julia Ross, who's written a couple great books, The Mood Cure, The Diet Cure. And I was asking her and telling her about Miriam. And I said, do you think that that has anything to do with it? And she's like, says, absolutely. There's really a big connection. There's even been studies on it. looking at that, that intergenerational trauma. And so coming back to just a couple years ago when she got diagnosed with colon cancer, and our colon, and that area in the body holds grief and fear. And so there's just so much ways that you can kind of connect it. And I really, when I reflect on her, when I reflect on her life, and and she also held a lot being a therapist. She gave a lot, but I really just feel like she was she had some of that within her to um, have a have that kind of an outcome. And I feel like there's such a connection there.
Yeah. I bet she's really grateful wherever she is now that we're having this conversation, you know? Yeah, I just wanna say
Yeah. Well, and it's amazing how much she comes up. Like I've been meeting a few people recently who are also really good friends with her, who I've gotten to know. And so, yeah, she comes in all the time. She's also my owl. The owl is her totem animal. And I now have two owls like living in the palm tree right outside my house that come out every night and make their presence known. And it's pretty, yeah, she's my owl.
So what I heard you saying, like what I really distilled down from the story is that Miriam had a constitutional sadness about her. And looking into her generational history, her father and her father's brother were the only survivors of the Holocaust in their family. And later in life, getting colon cancer, like that might have been the place where that sadness sort of took its toll in the body, or where the body expressed the sadness. Yeah. Yeah, that's very powerful. So yeah, to me, that's a really powerful example of how generational trauma can work. There was a study that I read about where mice were taught to fear the smell of cherries. That every time the cherry smell was like administered to them, they would receive a little electric shock. And through that electric shock, they learned to, be aversive to the smell of the cherries. Two generations down in their offspring, the grandchildren of those mice demonstrated the same signs of anxiety when they were exposed to the smell of cherries, even though they had never been directly subjected to those electric shocks. The other piece that is really fascinating here is that we begin our lives in our grandmother's body. So the ovum, the egg in our mothers that later becomes us, actually begins while our mothers are in our grandmother's belly. Our mothers are in utero with our grandmothers. So we actually begin in our grandmother's body. And I don't know, Mary Sheila, if you're familiar with Candace Pert and her teachings. Yeah, she talks about neuropeptides, like neurochemicals that can come from different emotional states. So like if our grandmothers were in a heavy duty survival mode, if our grandmothers experienced trauma, if our grandmothers were, having some challenge while pregnant with our mothers, like that, those peptides can directly influence the development of the fetus and then our development as well. The other piece I thought would be interesting to talk about, Mary Sheila, is obesity. And I don't know if you have anything to say about this, but there's also the whole phenomenon of the generational fear of famine and how that can pass downstream and its relationship to obesity. Is there anything you want to say about that?
Well, the first thing that pops in my head is not maybe what you were thinking I might say about it, but I just want to make a revelation of what I see today, right? Around the fear of famine. And that's the way that we shop today. And that's a lot at like the big box store, stocking up and having things on hand, which in some ways is a beautiful, wonderful thing. And maybe that's also an ancestral thing of, oh, all the tomatoes are in, let's can them, or let's can things, preserve things. So there is an element that we've always done with that. But there's also the element of going to Costco and stocking up on things that then all of a sudden they're in our cupboards, and maybe we thought we'd have them for a long time, but because they're maybe more of a comfort or refined food or something that comes in a package, we're going through it really quickly because we know it's there. It's sort of addicting. There's like a piece about that. And it's different than, every shopping more frequently, more freshly, at the market where you maybe we know the butcher and we know the grocer and we know where the vegetables are coming from the farm. And do you know what I mean? So
That's really fascinating, what you just said. And I want to sing back up on that. Uh, Back in the 1970s, we were facing a potential food shortage, a national food shortage in the United States. And it had to do with OPEC, the oil producing bloc in the Middle East, and, holding up petroleum and oil. And, our food system is a fossil fuel based food system. And that input was being, held up, or the prices were going up. And what happened was Richard Nixon, who was president at the time, went to his agriculture secretary, Earl Butz. And he said to Earl Butz, "We will never have a food shortage in this country. You do whatever you need to do to make sure that food is in continuous abundant supply." And what Earl Butz did was he ramrodded through Congress a whole series of legislation that we now know are government subsidies of big commodity crop producing food corporations, the ones that produce the corn and the soybeans and the wheat and all these big commodity crops. And that was in like the late 1970s. So that was where high fructose corn syrup was created. And it was all, and we can certainly talk about high fructose corn syrup. That might be another conversation. But all these refined products that came out of those big commodity crops, there was that piece. And then those foods were packed in supersized portions, supersized at the fast food, so soda went from like a Coke used to be like 8 ounces and now it's, 64 or whatever it is. So yeah, it's interesting to think about generational fear of famine and how it has resulted in our supersized commodity food system.
yeah. And that's really interesting. And the other piece it makes me think of is if you think about the intergenerational, I mean, how many of us, probably all of us, grew up being told to eat everything on your plate. And maybe the other half of that sentence was because there's people starving somewhere else.
Yeah.
And again, the way that we have been told to eat and the whole supersizing and the USDA recommendations, are those really true for our bodies? Are they really true for our body? I don't think so. And that's, there's so much like, well, I'm supposed to, and I'm supposed to, and like, supposed to be drinking milk with each, all these things that we've been told. Yet what happens if we pay attention and we actually don't eat everything on our plate because we reach our satiation point before all the food is gone, and we actually don't walk away from the meal totally full, have overeaten, and that can, lead to other things. So it really, that whole intergenerational thing of what we've been told, and who we've been told it from and how that was, passed down through the generations. It's like, well, let's step into this time and place today. What do I need? What does my body need now? What do I want to eat? Am I hungry? How hungry am I? What am I hungry for? Which are like my
Mary
three favorite
Sheila's
things.
mantra. Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, what you're saying about that is like basically we were guilt tripped into overeating.
Mm-hmm.
Guilt tripped, like, well, there's people starving in Africa, so you should stuff your face. It's like it makes no sense. It makes no sense at all. But our ancestors probably ate everything on their plate because their plate might have been like this, and maybe food was harder to come by. Our plates are like this, and food, certainly the processed foods, there's a term, overconsumptive malnutrition, or overnutrition, it's sometimes called, where we in the industrialized world, in the developed world, the average American consumes about 4,000 calories a day. But those calories are so nutritionally bankrupt that despite the fact of consuming all those calories, nutrient wise, we are malnourished, in terms of like essential fatty acids, in terms of micronutrients, minerals, all of that. Wow. Okay. So, woo, I didn't expect the conversation to go this way, but this is all really interesting. The point that I want to make about generational trauma is that there's different ways that we can work with it and different ways that we can heal it. We can certainly work with it on an emotional level. And, Mary Sheila's an Ayurveda practitioner, for those of you who aren't familiar with her work. And Mary Sheila, you have said many times that in Ayurveda, the root of illness is emotional. So we can work with generational trauma on an emotional level. And then we can also work with it on like a lifestyle level or a self-care level. And that's where I want to talk about cooking and preparing ancestral foods, which we'll get into in a second. Generational trauma is kind of like a river that flows down to us, right? It's something that we inherit. It's not something that we have actively participated in, but it is part of our reality. And what we can do is we in this generation can throw a log in that river and we can decide, we can say, that trauma, I am going to divert the stream. That trauma is going to end here. I'm not going to pass this down to my children. And EFT tapping is one of the best ways to work with generational trauma. So if you have something like what Mary Sheila described with Miriam, if you have like a sadness and you don't really know where it comes from, or you have something that you suspect is generational, you can simply tap and say, even though I have this and I don't know where it comes from, I think it might be generational. I deeply love and accept myself. And then as you tap and you go through what that is, you might get a feeling in your body. You might get a particular memory. You might hear a little voice of something your mother or grandmother said to you, maybe about your grandmother or what have you. Like pieces of the mystery might start coming in. So you can just simply, or not. The interesting thing about trauma is that we don't necessarily have to know all the details about it and where it came from in order to heal it. So as you tap, you can just resolve that as the pieces become available to you. That's one very, very powerful way to work with generational trauma. The other one is actually to honor your ancestors. And there's a beautiful way that you can do that ritually through cooking ancestral foods. And you and I, Mary Sheila, have had some really rich conversations about this. And I'm wondering if you want to just talk about that and maybe even talk about like your husband's experience of making his mother's ravioli or something. That was really cute when you were telling me about that.
Yeah, I mean, again, I think you brought up the 1970s before, and that was really the time of more fast food, convenient foods that came forward. And, a lot of moms and dads kind of gravitated towards that because life was kind of ramping up and being busier. And, wow, you could just pop this TV dinner in the microwave and serve dinner after a full day of work, right? So in some ways we may have lost what our ancestral foods are, and plus from being from Americans, we might have lost that anyway just in coming over to this country, our ancestors. But what so one of the questions is like, what are some of the ancestral foods, even just the foods you grew up with that were home cooked from scratch?
Mm.
And then if you don't have even any of those, which maybe you have some variety of that, what about other foods that run in your lineage, in your culture, right? So Italian, the raviolis. Yeah, so my husband, every Thanksgiving, I don't know if he's going to do it this year, but every Thanksgiving and Christmas, he makes his mom's raviolis. and he's altered it a little, and he has this really cool rolling pin that he uses, that she used, and we actually have her old ravioli table. But he gets really into it, and my daughter makes them with him now, and he makes the dough from scratch. And you know, can raviolis be healthy? Sure. Do they have gluten in them? And a lot of people can't do gluten, whatever. But like, it's so different when you make something from scratch. You make something from scratch. It takes like all day to make raviolis, or your own pasta noodles for that matter, right? Which is kind of similar. And so you're not going to make those kind of things from scratch all the time, but there's a lot of magic and tradition and stories that come out and come through when you're doing something like that, and it can be very healing. And and so anytime there's a talk of ancestral cooking and food, what it also kind of means in some ways, to me anyway, is our ancestors did the work for us. They learned how to make foods more digestible. They practice the art. Like, we didn't just start eating tortillas and bagels when we started eating wheat. We actually started it with sourdough breads that were naturally fermented without any added yeast. It was just fermented from the bacteria that existed in the air. And that started a process of actually breaking down the hard to digest proteins, which are the glutens, and breaking down the sugars, allowing the bacteria to grow and start to eat those sugars, which is a lot of the carbohydrates in the gluten. And then it's much more digestible. Same thing with like miso or tempeh. Like, all we have learned, or marinating meats, we have learned, and these all take time. That's, I think, a piece of our ancestral cooking, and getting into it and honoring them, is maybe a little more space for cooking and creating in the kitchen, and allowing things to become more creative and fun and delicious, instead of the mantra of maybe like, I don't have time, and healthy food is just so bland, it doesn't taste good. And I'm like, that's not true.
That too.
Yeah, exactly.
Whoever said that obviously has not been in Mary Sheila's kitchen. Oh, funny. That it's interesting. I made my mother's all day tomato sauce the other day. So my mother used to put a huge stock pot of on the stove, and she would make tomato sauce, and she would make meatballs and sausage from scratch, put them in the tomato sauce, and then she also put in bones. Like, she would get these like beef shanks or leg bones or whatever, and put them in the tomato sauce. And I made this the other day, and I realized, like, bone broth is such a is all the rage these days, right? Everybody talks about bone broth. And one of the pieces that makes something a bone broth versus just a regular broth is that acid that we usually put in, like a splash of vinegar, right? And that helps to draw the minerals out of the bones in the bone broth. My mother was making bone broth ahead of her time, because the acid from the tomatoes was drawing out those minerals. After the sauce was cooked, not only did I have meatballs and sausage, but I had this wonderful bone marrow. She used to give it to the dog, but now, now I'm
Yeah.
eating it. So the whole thing about ancestral cooking that I'm hearing from you, and from my own experience, Mary Sheila, is that, cooking the way our ancestors did, it was a slower process. It was from scratch. Sometimes, what did we say? Scratch and batch. Like, sometimes it's from scratch, and it's also, batch cooking, because you might have, like in my mother's case, she had a whole bunch of tomatoes from the garden that had to be processed very quickly. So she would make this broth, this sauce rather, and then, put it in the freezer, and we had it all winter long. And then the other piece that I hear is also the methods, like the fermentation or the drying, or even freezing, canning, etc. So I want to encourage those of you who are watching this video to do a little research on your own. Maybe you just start with your pen and paper and sit down in some cozy corner of your home and think about the home cooked foods that you ate as a child, and see if you can trace trace them back to grandmothers, great grandmothers. If you were raised on the processed foods that we've been talking about, then maybe do a little research. You could ask if your relatives are still alive, ask your cousins, ask your aunts, ask your grandparents if they're still around, like what did they eat as children? Or just do some research on the web, like what did your ethnicity, people of your ethnicity eat, say 100 years ago? And try your hand at making some of those foods, like set a day aside and make it a sacred, special honoring of the ancestors, and make it an intentional act of diverting the ancestral stream, especially if there was trauma in that stream. And the last thing I want to say about this is you can culminate your ancestor cooking by creating like a little altar, a little candle, a picture of your relatives. And just when you're ready to eat the food, take a little plate and put just a little bit of tiny portions of the food on and just put it in front of their picture with you know, a little gesture of appreciation, because the truth is, no matter what our ancestors experienced, we do, and no matter what trauma was passed down to us, we have a debt of gratitude to them because we're here. We're here because of them.
Yeah.
So I think that's all I've got to say, Mary Sheila. Is there anything else you want to add to that?
It just reminds me of one other thing that it's just happened over the weekend. And, you know, my husband likes to, he loves to cook. He's Italian too, like you, Marcella. And we used to have a restaurant. So he loves cooking. He loves to watch cooking shows and things like that. And he was watching a chef make some things and I caught wind of it. And I like to cook whole chickens. And, I have a problem. I mean, I didn't learn how to cook whole chickens from anybody. I kind of had to figure it out. I've read a few cookbooks. So I watched this chef's technique and I was like, oh my gosh. And so on Saturday, I made this chicken, and usually when I cook the chicken, the breasts are really dry. So it's a struggle, and it was so good. It was so flavorful, and so it's like there's so many ways that we can learn. This chef likely has been masterly trained, and maybe also grew up in a house that he had his mothers and aunties and grandmothers teaching him, and then he went to school. So it's okay if you are at square one, or if you're already feel like you're a good rock star cook. There's always more to learn. And so I was so excited and I made it, and it was like the best chicken. And of course my chef husband is very sweet and kind when I cook, but he'll give me honest feedback and critique, and he was like, this is the best chicken you have ever cooked. And I was like, oh. So like it's a process, it's a journey. Like be guided by your taste buds, make it fun, make it delicious, because that's really how it should be. It's like fun, delicious, and nutritious, right? And yeah, you're going to spend a little time and energy and money buying the food and time in your kitchen, but like you want it to be good, so it's worth it.
What you're saying reminds me that traditions can be updated.
Yes.
So, there might be ingredients that our ancestors used in their cooking that either we don't want to use anymore, or they're not available, or they're really expensive, or whatever. But that's where tradition can be adapted.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, good for you for making that chicken. I want a little bit now. I'm starting to get hungry. I can almost smell it cooking. All right. Well, let us know how it goes with your journey of ancestral healing. And this is Marcella and Mary Sheila sending you love. Bye for now.
Bye.